In June of 2021, a young man suddenly left his job site in Buckeye, Arizona, only 15 minutes after arriving at work. As family and friends pushed police to search, nothing was found. Then, 3 weeks later, his SUV, clothes, and belongings were found not far from where he disappeared. A year later, there has been no further sign of Daniel Robinson. As new information has emerged, officials have begun to deliver a tale of a troubled and heartbroken young man. But his family insists that this portrayal wasn't the Daniel they knew. They know he would never have disappeared and left them to worry. And Daniel's father refuses to give up on the search for his son. He won't stop until he brings Daniel home. Hi everyone, welcome to Black Cat Crimes, or welcome back if you've seen my first video. I'm Victoria and I am so very happy to have you here. I just wanted to say thank you so much already for 26 subscribers. I'm so excited with the response I had to my first video, and I just want to say thank you for your patience as I got this second video out. Part of it was learning how to research and write scripts and video editing and all the things that go into making a YouTube video. But the other part of it was that my cat, who I've had since I was 6, passed away while I was researching and writing the script for this video. So I needed to take a little time off and just be sad and kind of figure out what life is like without him. So thank you for your patience. So this case and video will actually be the first in a series that I'm starting on my channel. I have to admit, I didn't make the connection I'll be highlighting in this series, but I really wanted to talk about it and make it its own individual series because there are so many cases that fall into line with it. If you listen to the podcast Crime Junkie, they released an episode on October 25th of 2021 called Missing Young Men from Their Cars. And in this episode, they discussed 3 cases, one of which we're going to be talking about today, of young men who disappeared from their cars and have not been found since they went missing. What's interesting is that I actually didn't remember that episode covered Daniel Robinson's case whenever I set out to research this case. I was like halfway through researching it and I was like, oh my gosh, he's a young man who went missing from his car. And then I went back and looked for the episode so I could reference it for this series and for this case, and found out that he was in fact one of the 3 young men that they talked about in that episode. So in this episode, they highlight the connection of so many young men going missing from their cars inexplicably. And not like they got in their car and just drove away, which sometimes happen. People do voluntarily go missing and leave their lives, but like their car is pulled over on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere and they're just gone. Or their car was crashed either in a populated area or in a more rural area, and once again, the men are just gone with no sign of where they went. Most of the young men in these situations have never been found. As a matter of fact, most of the cases I know that very notoriously fit this theme of going missing from their cars, none of these men have been found. It's like they literally walked off the face of the earth. Some of these men seemed totally normal. Others seemed confused or like they weren't making sense. Others were upset or angry with what was going on currently. But the thing that connects them all is that they got in their car with the intention of going somewhere, not just for a drive or, just to clear their mind or something. They were in the middle of doing something or going somewhere with intention. And then later, their car is either found pulled off on the side of the road and parked somewhere, or their car has been crashed and the men are just gone. There's no sign of which direction they went or what could have happened to them. So it's a really bizarre phenomenon that even goes beyond the 3 cases that were discussed in the Crime Junkie episode, and that's why I wanted to create an entire series so that we can talk about each of these cases individually. And unfortunately, it's still happening to this day that young men are just disappearing from their cars and not being found. So we will have a space to specifically talk about these odd cases that fit this theme. So I talk more about this phenomenon in a short introduction video at the beginning of a playlist called Men Going Missing from Their Cars. So this will be the first case in that playlist. So if you want to hear a little bit more about this phenomenon and why I'm covering it, you'll find that in that short video. But today we're starting with the case of Daniel Robinson, a young man who has been missing for a little over a year now. Hopefully, if we keep talking about him and we keep highlighting his case, he'll be brought home to his family. So my last video ended up being over an hour long, so for this case I wanted to try 2 videos that would be a little bit shorter. And see if that was something y'all liked better. Please feel free to let me know in the comments down below which you would prefer in the future. I like to know all the details whenever I listen to a true crime case because I find that all the details are really important, which is why my first video was so long, which is why this video will also be long enough to be 2 parts. So if you'd rather get all the information at once and have really long videos that may just take me a little bit longer, that's totally fine. Or if you would prefer shorter videos that you have to commit less time to at a moment, in like a specific moment, then I'm more than happy to make that work too. I would just really appreciate your feedback. Okay, but getting back to why we're here. So I was a little bit torn on how I wanted to cover this case originally. There's just so much going on in every part of this case. Additionally, there are basically 2 storylines going on at the exact same time being put out to the public. And in all honesty, we don't completely know everything that happened, even in the moments after Daniel originally went missing. We just don't know everything yet. So going into this case, we need to know a couple things. There is a narrative that the police are pushing that Daniel's father, David, denies 90% of. He has his own theories and has honestly done his own entire investigation into his son's disappearance. So it's really hard to know what's completely the truth right now. And because there are 2 narratives happening at the same time, I think the best way to tell you Daniel's story is to try to cover those 2 narratives at the same time. So on September 23rd, 2021, Buckeye Police released a police report about Daniel's investigation. Now, I'm going to be going through this police report in detail, and alongside that, I'm going to be informing you of David's findings, his theories, and corrections they have made in public regarding some of what's in the police report. Hopefully this will keep the case from getting super repetitive because basically, like I said, 90% of it, David seems to have an explanation for, a different theory about, or just different information that he wants known as well. So to not make it so repetitive, I don't want to split it up into here's what the police think and found and here's what David thinks and found, because I think it's just going to be easier to cover all that at once. So really by doing this, you're going to get all the information you need about each point of this case that we need to discuss. Now, I do want to give Buckeye Police a fair shake, which is why I am going through the police report in such detail of what they've done and what they found. I have to say up front though, I do agree with David that they didn't do the best job investigating Daniel's disappearance, but they did do some things, which is why I want to discuss everything that they did. I just don't think they went about it in the best way, but I am going to talk about what they found, what they did, and what David has found and what he's done as well. And with all that said, so you have all the prefaces you need up front, let's begin talking about the case of Daniel Robinson. So Daniel's father, David, speaks very highly of his son. He describes him as a scientist and a great young man, a very talented geologist. Daniel loves nature and exploring and hiking and just being outside all the time. And that's part of why he chose to become a geologist. David says that Daniel has a brilliant mind and is very loved by his friends and family. So Daniel was born without his right hand and lower forearm, but David said that Daniel never let it stop him or slow him down. They did end up trying to get him like a prosthetic hand at some point when he was a few years old, and Daniel really wanted nothing to do with it. At that point, he'd learned how to do everything when he was younger, so he just didn't see the point in having one. Daniel really took on every challenge he could. He played some sports when he was younger, like football, and did some weightlifting, but he never really got super into it. but he was actually in the band all through high school and played several different instruments, including the French horn, the trombone, and the trumpet. So in college, Daniel was very social and made sure to have lots of fun while he learned. And though he was a bit of a partier, he still made sure to take his schooling very serious, and he graduated with honors in 2019. And after he graduated from college, he was able to get a job as a geologist with Matrix New World. So David said that Daniel was close friends with the child of the owners of Matrix, and so that kind of helped him get a foot in the door. But honestly, it seems like Daniel had pretty good credentials, so I'm sure that they were more than happy to, get him out to Arizona and get him started as a geologist. Before Daniel could begin working at Matrix, he needed to complete one more course in Flagstaff, Arizona, and then he could move on to Phoenix, where the job would be. David explains that he doesn't completely know why Daniel needed to take this course before he could go on, but that Daniel was more than happy to make that stop in Flagstaff and take the course, and then he was off to Phoenix as soon as he was done with it. The thing was, though, that whenever Daniel finished the course and was ready to go to Phoenix, he didn't have a place to live yet because he hadn't been there. And so David explains that this was one of the only times he really encouraged one of his children to come home for a little while, because Daniel didn't have a place he was going to stay, but he was determined to go ahead. So Daniel stayed in a hostel for a couple of weeks while he began working at Matrix. And while he was staying at that hostel, he actually made friends with someone who worked at Matrix named Roger. And when Roger found out that Daniel had been staying in a hostel for these few weeks, he actually offered for him to move in with him and his girlfriend until he found a place to live. Daniel would end up staying with Roger for about a month until he found a place with a roommate in Phoenix, and at that point he would move out. But during the time they were living together, Roger and Daniel were able to become close and really good friends. They said that they would, drive into work together because they were going to the same place, so they'd carpool. And after Daniel moved out, they would still meet up and hang out with each other and do different things. So, he did have a few friends in Phoenix. In an interview with Kendall Ray and Josh of Mile Higher podcast, David talked a lot about his son and about the things he was proud of. Honestly, his whole face lights up when he talks about Daniel and all the things he accomplished and all the things he loved about his son. It was really interesting learning about Daniel from his own father. And so David told them this story of Daniel buying this raggedy little car whenever he moved out to Phoenix. And that, it wasn't the best car, but David was really proud of Daniel because, growing up, David had taught them how to work on their own cars, how to take care of their cars. And so Daniel was using all this knowledge to keep this little car together and keep it going. And he was really proud of the fact that he was able to do that. And Daniel really loved living in Arizona. David talks about how he and Daniel's mom, his ex-wife, kind of sheltered them growing up. They didn't go on a lot of outdoor trips or camping trips or anything like that. So they really didn't know how much Daniel loved nature and wanted to be in nature until he started taking these trips in college with all of his friends and, started hiking and camping and doing all these different things, going all these really cool places that, he really did love the outdoors, and that's where he wanted to be. So Daniel seemed to be loving the terrain and the areas in Arizona where he could go hiking. He seemed to really be thriving in this environment, and David describes it as a geologist's dream with all those rocks out there. And after a while of working at Matrix, Daniel was able to take on a couple of upgrades in his life. He was able to get a better car. He ended up buying a 2017 blue-gray Jeep Renegade that he was really proud of and super excited to show his family. And he was also able to move into his own apartment in Tempe, Arizona. At some point after he was living on his own, Daniel's sister, Davisha, moved out to Arizona as well. She stayed with him for about a month after she moved out there, and then she was able to get her own place in Phoenix, Arizona. They were both really happy to have each other in Arizona because the rest of their family did live in other states, so it was nice that they at least had each other in this area. And in June of 2021, the Robinson family were making plans to come visit Davisha and Daniel in July of 2021. These plans were pretty set, and Daniel was very excited to have everyone come visit. He was excited to show his family the life he'd been building in Arizona. He had a new car, his new apartment, and he was especially excited to show his dad the computer he'd been building because his father's a computer engineer. Daniel was just a happy guy who seemed to be doing well in life from what family and friends could tell. He was in a state that was a dream for geologists. His father said in multiple interviews that Daniel was enjoying the work he was doing while also enjoying going hiking and seeing friends and going different places in Arizona at the time. I mean, he got a good job in his field of choice right out of college, and he had good friends and his sister in the area he was living that he got to see often. So knowing all that, we have to ask, why are we here? What happened to Daniel? And what on earth possibly could have made him drive off into the desert on June 23rd of last year? So before we get into the day Daniel went missing, let's talk about what happened in the days before. On the morning of June 21st, Roger came into the office at Matrix and was surprised to see Daniel there. Daniel worked in the field as a geologist, so it was very rare for him to ever be in the office. As a matter of fact, I think Matrix said something like Daniel had never been to the office before. Roger said that beyond Daniel being in the office, he was also taken aback by the fact that Daniel had cut his hair short because previously Daniel had been trying to grow his hair out. So he was just a little shocked that Daniel had cut all of his hair off. It seemed odd to him. I should mention, as a side note, that David doesn't think this is super weird. Daniel apparently changed his hair all the time, so David didn't take this as something super weird. He probably just thought Daniel got tired of growing out his hair, and so he decided to cut it off. But on that morning, Roger, who wasn't used to his friend being in the office, went over to Daniel to talk. But Roger said that Daniel was super dry with him, and when Roger tried to ask Daniel if he was okay, Daniel didn't say much of anything. Because Daniel's a pretty personable guy, and him and Roger were good friends, Roger definitely thought this was weird. Roger told a detective later that that's when he thought, something's up with Daniel, something's not right, I need to talk to him. So, because he thought this was so odd, Roger asked Daniel if he wanted to go get breakfast so they could talk a little bit. And Daniel straight up told him no, he didn't want to get breakfast. So, Roger just decided to go back to his desk and start working. And a few minutes later, Daniel texted Roger and asked if he wanted to go to breakfast. So, Roger said that he would, and they decided to take Roger's truck to breakfast at Chick-fil-A. Roger again took this opportunity to ask Daniel if he was okay, but Daniel really didn't tell him if anything was bothering him. And when they got to Chick-fil-A, Roger asked Daniel what he wanted, and Daniel said just get him whatever Roger was ordering. And Roger remembers thinking that this is really weird because Daniel had a usual order. He had something he usually wanted, so the fact that he just told him to order what he was getting seemed odd. After they got their food, Roger kind of took the opportunity to guess at what he thought Daniel's problems might be. So he asked if there was a problem with a woman. Daniel didn't go into much detail, but he did tell Roger something along the lines of there was a woman that he knew, but she had no idea he existed. And after this, Daniel asked Roger some questions that Roger had no idea how to make sense of. So during their drive back to their work, Roger's sister called him because Roger's father was going through some health issues, and so his sister was calling to give him an update and just talk to him a little bit. And after he hung up the phone, Daniel asked Roger if he believed in miracles. And I don't know what Roger's response was, but after this, Daniel told him that maybe he should start believing in miracles. And Daniel went on to mention something about God or religion, and this really took Roger back a bit because they'd never really talked about things like religion or God before, so he was just a little surprised that that's what Daniel chose to talk to him about out of everything. Now, David did talk about this specific line of conversation in an interview. He explains that he is religious, and Daniel was raised in a religious household where they went to church and believed in God, so maybe because of Daniel's weird mood, he was trying to talk about believing in miracles and God with Roger, but because he was acting a bit odd and was in a weird mood, maybe it just came across weird. But it does seem like maybe just because him and Roger hadn't ever really talked about this, it took Roger aback a little bit. But after talking about religion, Daniel asked Roger if he trusted him. And Roger said yes, of course he did. But Daniel pushed this and asked him if he really trusted him. And, Roger said, of course, you're my friend. Of course I trust you. And Daniel pushed even again and asked, would you still trust me if we weren't friends? So it seems like after this, the conversation took yet another turn because Daniel said something to Roger about needing to get rid of his ego because ego is bad. And Roger was, again, kind of taken aback and told Daniel that he didn't think he had an ego. He was just a confident guy. But Daniel would respond with, well, I have to get rid of my story. And this again confused Roger because Daniel was proud of who he was and where he came from, so he didn't understand why he would want to get rid of who he was or his story. So after they got back to work, obviously this conversation ended and Roger had to go back to his desk to work, but he was kind of surprised that Daniel again stayed in the office for a little bit longer. While he was there, Roger saw Daniel walk by wearing his Miami Heat hat that he really loved. The weird part was Daniel mentioned to Roger that he should probably get rid of this hat, and Roger told him he thought that was silly because he knew Daniel loved that hat and he should keep it because why not? And shortly after this, Daniel would leave the office carrying a box with unknown contents, and he said nothing else to Roger before he left. And so I believe on the evening of the 21st, Daniel would have a conversation with his father, David, on the phone. David said the call was pretty normal for them. David said he knew that when Daniel called, they would be on the phone for 2 hours. And so if he couldn't answer right then, he would have to text him, like, I'll call you back whenever I finish this, because they were always going to be on the phone for the next 2 hours at least. So he was able to answer it this time, though, and they talked for a long time, as they always did. And he felt that Daniel was acting normal on the call. Daniel mentioned a podcast he had listened to because a girl had sent it to him. He wanted his father to listen to it as well. Daniel also asked his father if he thought he had an ego because a woman he'd spoken with had told him he had an ego and needed to work on it. What's interesting is that David told Daniel something similar, nearly identical to what Roger had told Daniel earlier that day. You don't have an ego. You're a confident young man. That's not egotistical. David assured Daniel that he was a great guy and just confident, and then asked Daniel to go ahead and send him that podcast because he wanted to listen to it too. And of course, since Daniel mentioned that a woman had sent him this podcast and told him he had a bit of an ego, David asked Daniel where he'd met this woman, and Daniel would tell him that he met her while delivering groceries for Instacart. Now, David was surprised to learn this because he actually didn't know that Daniel was delivering for Instacart at this time. So Davisha would later explain why he was delivering for Instacart, and basically what was happening was that he had to buy equipment for his job at Matrix with his own money, and he had to pay for gas with his own money, and then he would submit receipts to Matrix so that they could, reimburse him. A lot of companies do this, especially with gas, and like if you have to travel a lot, they'll do it with hotel rooms where like you go ahead and pay for them and then they'll just reimburse you for it on paychecks. And so I guess the reimbursement process was just taking a while. And so because he had to drive out to all these different places to look at these well sites and different job sites, his gas bill would have built up a little quickly, and he'd bought this equipment, so he just was kind of low on funds and was worried he was going to miss some bills. So instead of falling behind or worrying about having to ask somebody to front him the money, he just got a job delivering for Instacart so he could get ahead of it. But this wouldn't be information that we would really know until later, and as I said, this is the first time David had learned about Daniel delivering for Instacart. Daniel also asked David about love. He asked his dad, what is love? David didn't think this was too weird because in their family they talked about concepts like this all the time. They were all scientists and analytical people, so they would have these long conversations even about abstract topics and like talk about things and break them down. And so Daniel had never really had a real relationship before, so he thought, maybe that's why he's asking about it. He's just thinking about love and wanting to know about it. So they talked about that for a while, but David didn't take this as like a red flag that he was like in love with anybody, or, thinking, oh, I should be wondering what's going on in his dating life, because he's not talking a lot about this woman he did meet, and he asked Love more about in broader sense, not how do I know I'm in love, or I met this woman and I think I'm in love. It was nothing like that. Daniel had mentioned a woman in terms of talking about the podcast and her thinking he had an ego, but he never expressed to David in this conversation that he was in love with her, or if she was like a special love interest or anything like that. Overall, David didn't think Daniel seemed off in this conversation. He didn't seem upset, sad, stressed, none of it. In fact, Daniel even told David that he and Davisha had plans to go hiking that weekend. Here's the thing about this call too. David would record work calls on his cell phone, but he made a point of never recording personal calls. But on this day, this phone call was recorded. And he said it's by God's grace. It was the Lord looking out for him when that call was recorded, because he has been able to go back and listen to it time and time again. And every time he's listened to it, there have been no clues as to what was coming or clues about where Daniel would have gone. He still doesn't think the conversation sounds weird, even after listening to it all this time in the light of Daniel going missing. And so that is nice that he has that last recording of their last phone conversation together to review in this situation. On June 22nd, when Roger arrived at work, he found Daniel there again. Daniel asked Roger this time if he wanted to go get breakfast, and Roger agreed, so this time they took Daniel's Jeep. Roger said that as they drove, Daniel did acknowledge that there was a woman, but he wouldn't give any more information than that. Daniel did ask Roger, though, what if there was a girl you liked, but you couldn't have her? And Roger told Daniel that if he liked a girl, he should go for it and ask her out. But Daniel again began talking about ego and asking questions similar to those he had the day before. Still, though, Daniel would not come out and say exactly what was bothering him to Roger. And Roger would tell investigators that it seemed like Daniel thought he had to totally remake himself to be able to be with this woman he was interested in. So after they got back to the office that morning, Roger would go back to his desk and begin working, and Daniel would be around for about 15 more minutes before he'd leave without saying anything else to Roger. Now we're going to be moving on to the evening of June 22nd and an interaction Daniel had with his sister Davisha. So since Daniel and Davisha lived in the same area, they had like an emergency code that they would send each other if something truly emergent ever happened. And, my family has had a code word like this for when we were little. It was so we didn't go with strangers. Now we know that we could send that word as a code word that we're in immediate trouble and we need help. So basically the rule was if one of them sent this code word to each other, the other needed to immediately spring into action because they were in an emergency currently. On the night of the 22nd, Davisha got this emergency text from her brother, and obviously she was immediately worried. She called Daniel a few times, but he didn't answer his phone, so she reached out to her father next to ask him what he thought she should do. David told her to, take a deep breath and then go to Daniel's apartment and see if he was there, see if she could try to find him because he wasn't answering his phone. When she got to Daniel's apartment in Tempe, she lived in Phoenix, so she drove over to Tempe to check on Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there, but his Jeep was in the parking lot. Now, even more worried, she called David back and told him that she found Daniel's car, but Daniel wasn't here. He wasn't home at all. And while she was on the phone with her dad, Daniel would walk up to her in the parking lot. Of course, Davisha immediately asked Daniel where he'd been and if he was okay, and Daniel explained that he'd gone to the Waffle House not that far away to grab some food. His car was there because he had taken the bus to the Waffle House and then taken an Uber back. And now that Daniel was there, Davisha hung up the phone with David And she would explain that she asked Daniel why in the world he sent her this emergency text that made her come all the way over here, and then he wasn't answering his phone. Daniel would tell his sister that he was just pulling a Daniel, which meant like he was joking around with her. He was just trying to test to see how quickly she would respond to this emergency text from him. And now knowing that Daniel was okay, everybody was able to relax, and Davisha would go home to her apartment in Phoenix. According to David, based on GPS location they were able to recover from his computer later on, it seems like Daniel worked late into the night for Instacart on the night of the 22nd into the early morning of the 23rd. We know this because his Google location synced up to his Google account on his computer, and it shows his movements pretty much through and back and forth from a grocery store. And on the morning of June 23rd, 2021, after a long night of delivering for Instacart, Daniel would get into his car and at 6:26 a.m. begin making the drive from Tempe to Buckeye, making a few stops along the way. Surveillance footage shows that he stopped at a Shell station in Buckeye, Arizona from 7 a.m. to 7:03 a.m. The odd thing, though, is while he was there, he would only pump $3.83 worth of gas. So I did a little bit of a dive on this, and I looked up the average cost of gas in June 2021 in Arizona. And on June 1st of 2021, the average price of gas in Arizona was $3.12 a gallon, ranging somewhere from like $2.80 a gallon up to like $4.15 a gallon, depending on where you were getting it. So that means that he pumped about a gallon of gas, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And this made me look up the fuel capacity for a 2017 Jeep Renegade. So a 2017 Jeep Renegade has a 12.7 gallon gas tank on it, and it averages about 24 miles to the gallon. So given all that information, it seems a little weird that Daniel would only put about a gallon of gas in his car, because it just honestly wouldn't get him very far. So David addresses this in his Mile Higher podcast interview as well, and he agrees that it's really odd. He wanted to point out, first of all, that police do not have the financial records stating that he made this purchase. It was something that the family looked up and showed them, like, on their phone that he had made this purchase. They don't actually have, like, a copy of his records that they got from the bank. So there's that he wants people to know first. So the way they found out about this purchase was literally the family being able to log into Daniel's bank account and Davisha like showing police on her phone the exact charges that he made from that, not them getting his bank records and then being able to show what purchases he made. His second point was that he really doesn't think Daniel would only put a gallon of gas in his car. Police claim they have surveillance footage of Daniel pumping gas at this gas station from 7 a.m. to 7:03 when he would drive out. But David doubts this because they have not shown him any footage of this, incident. And they refuse to show him footage or stills, despite the fact that they have showed him stills of other surveillance footage. So given that there's such a weird action from Daniel and mixed with the fact that police refused to show David any proof that Daniel is the one pumping gas in his car, despite the fact that they claim they have surveillance footage of him doing this, he just kind of doubts that they have proof that he's the one who pumped gas, and David does not believe that Daniel would be the one who pumped $3.83 worth of gas into his car. And I mean, on the one hand, I get that police tend to withhold certain surveillance footage and things like that if they feel that it's going to compromise a case. But they've showed him stills of other surveillance footage to prove that they have it and to show what Daniel is doing. And so, David really doesn't understand why, 3 minutes of footage would be something he isn't allowed to see if it would just blatantly prove what happened. So I also tried to put myself in the mindset of what Daniel might be doing at this time. As a 25-year-old with some money problems, there are times when pumping $5 of gas into my car is something I may do because it's just enough to like get me home or get me to the grocery store and back or whatever I need to do at that moment. But here's some things that are different between me and Daniel whenever I make that decision. I work from home. So whenever I pump, 20 to 30 miles worth of gas into my car, that's going to get me 3 or 4 different places in the little local area I live in. It's not going to be a huge deal for me. I'm going to have plenty to get home, to get around, to do everything I need to do in, $5 or $10 worth of gas. Another thing is I have a smaller car with better mileage. So 2 gallons of gas is going to get me around 60 to 70 miles worth of travel. Daniel, however, had to travel a lot for his job. The distance between Buckeye to Tempe alone is 45 miles. So that 1-ish gallon of gas isn't going to be enough to get him home later if he was trying to kind of fill up, an already empty tank. Not to mention, he's going to make another stop before he even goes out to the job site he's supposed to be working at that day. So that adds even more mileage that he's going to have to travel. So that means that he pumped what would probably get him about 24 miles around into his tank when he was going to be traveling in excess of at least 60 more miles that day. And this is what makes pumping this 1 gallon of gas just seem so odd. And listen, the family has gained access to Daniel's bank records. If he was just so broke that only $4 was all he could put into his tank of gas, they would have mentioned that. And it would have been obvious whenever they logged in. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and it doesn't seem to say anywhere that he was just out of money in his bank account. And that would be an explanation as to why he only pumped $4 worth of gas. But anyway, so after Daniel was done at the Shell station, where he was for 3 minutes, he would go on to another work site that wasn't the one he was going to be working at that day. He got there very shortly after being at the Shell station and would take 2 pictures of some equipment and some logbooks at this site at around 7:10 a.m. From here, he headed out to the area he would be working in that day in Buckeye off the Sun Valley Parkway. He never worked at this job site before, nor had he been out to this area of the desert. And this would be the first time he would work with a guy named Ken, who worked for like another company, but they would be working together at this well site out in the desert. So according to Ken's first phone interview with Officer Cruz, Daniel arrived to the job site at around 9 a.m. It was raining a little bit that morning, and him and Daniel just kind of started by talking about the usual things. But after a few short minutes, Ken started to notice that Daniel seemed off to him. They hadn't chatted much, but Ken just felt like some of the things Daniel was saying to him didn't make sense and seemed just off of what normal conversation would be between people who didn't know each other that well. He also said that Daniel asked him if he wanted to go rest and then if he wanted to go back to Phoenix to rest. And then shortly after this, at around 9:15 a.m., Daniel would just get in his car and leave without saying anything to Ken. In the second call Ken would have with investigators, though, his story to Officer Halley is a little bit different. So in this version, Ken said that Daniel arrived at the work site around 9:30 a.m. And he also added that Daniel seemed to be staring off into the distance, like into the desert a lot, and just not saying anything. He was just staring at nothing or at something that Ken couldn't identify in the desert. Ken also told Officer Halley that when Daniel did talk to him, it was about non-work related things, which he found especially odd. He asked Ken, "Do you want to go home?" and "Do you want to go rest in Phoenix?" In this statement, Ken said at about 9:45 a.m. it was raining, and so they needed to figure out when the rain was going to pass. So Ken offered to check the weather app on his phone so that they could decide when they would be able to work. While he was checking his phone, Ken looked up and Daniel was getting into his Jeep. And Daniel waved to him and then drove off without saying anything whatsoever to Ken. Ken watched Daniel drive south, seemingly further into the desert. And Daniel would never return to work, call into work, or call anyone he knew again. So I think we can all agree that someone getting into their car and just driving away from a job that they were at 45 minutes away from their home without saying anything is beyond odd. And that is why Ken said he called his boss Steve to tell him that Daniel just drove off without saying anything. But Ken would not call Daniel even though he had his phone number because they'd spoken that morning. According to David, they played a little phone tag, sent a few texts, and then actually connected and were able to talk to each other. And David does kind of talk about the questions that Daniel asked Ken about wanting to go rest. He thinks there's a pretty logical explanation for these. So Daniel had been working really late the night before, and it's really possible he was tired. I mean, if it sounds like he was working until midnight, 1 or 2, somewhere around there. So if he got up at 6 the next morning to head to work, I'm sure he was exhausted. And one thing to know about a lot of utility or construction or, on-site type of jobs is that they can't always work in the rain. Whether it's because of the dangers of a storm cell being nearby, like lightning or even flash floods in an area that's super dry. There's also the risk of, not being able to properly hold tools or power tools not working, or they're having to go underground for any sort of thing. They can't go underground while water's literally pouring out of the sky. Like, that's not an option. And for some companies, if there's lightning strikes within a certain distance of a job site, they can't work until the lightning strikes then move out of a certain distance as well, just to keep everybody safe. So given that Daniel could have been pretty tired that morning, it's now raining and they can't really work. And according to David, he would have had the authority to say like, oh, we can't work today or we can't work for now because of the weather. So maybe these questions are more like, do you want to go rest somewhere? Or do you want to just like head back to Phoenix for now and rest until the storm passes? And not these super crazy, like, do you want to go off somewhere type questions that they kind of make it sound like. And Daniel being super tired could explain why he was just staring off into the desert. They didn't know each other that well, and maybe he wasn't feeling super talkative that morning. So whenever there were lulls in conversation, he was just staring off into the desert because there is a lot of vegetation in this area, and so maybe he was just staring at the landscape and not necessarily at anything in particular. So given that, let's talk about the rest of what Ken said happened that day. So in both of his statements, Ken explains that he eventually goes looking for Daniel, and this seems to be around 3 p.m. Because at this point, he'd received word from work that no one had heard or seen Daniel. He never showed up at an office, nobody had been able to get in contact with him, and he just seemed to be gone. So Ken decided that he would drive out in the direction Daniel had and see if he could find him somewhere. Maybe he was hanging out in the desert somewhere and they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. So the road out to the job site they were working at ran north to south. And so if you went south, you basically came to a T at the end of this road. And if you went east, you went back to the Sun Valley Parkway. And if you went west, you would go further into the desert. So Ken followed Daniel's tire tracks in the southward direction, and then whenever he got to this T, he saw that there were fresh tracks going west, further into the desert. In his second statement, Ken verified that the reason he knew that this tracks going west were most likely Daniel's was because it had been raining that day, and so these seemed like very fresh tracks that wouldn't have been washed away from the rain. Ken would drive down this road trying to find Daniel, but he couldn't. Now, in his interview with Kendall and Josh, David discusses the fact that Matrix set up a meeting between him and Ken to discuss this morning that him and Daniel spent together and his searching for Daniel. So David and Ken met up near the job site where Daniel had gone missing from, and David claims that Ken's story was different whenever they spoke. From what David explains, it seems like Ken's story was more elaborate and detailed from what he talked about. But I do believe that David and Davisha may have heard more in this conversation because throughout that interview, there are a couple different times when David says that Ken's original statements to police are lies. Not that they're missing details, but that they're lies. Now, I find this interesting because you have to wonder what a coworker who had supposedly never met Daniel before, who only knew him for all of 15 minutes while he was acting weird, would have. What motive would they have to lie, you know? Like, why would someone who basically didn't know somebody else and supposedly only talked to them for 15 minutes, why would they lie? The details that David had regarding his conversation with Ken revolve more around the details of Ken searching for Daniel. Basically, Ken told David that he jumped in his car and immediately began looking for Daniel down this road. And he made sure to stay to the side of Daniel's tracks so that he didn't drive over them. He also apparently was getting out of his car along the way to mark rocks with red spray paint to, line the path that Daniel seemed to have taken out into the desert to the point where his tire tracks ended and weren't able to be followed anymore. And Ken said that he stayed to the side of the tracks and marked these rocks specifically so police would have a path to follow to come look for him later. And so the thing about this happening is David wonders, and I have to wonder too, if Ken was willing to go so above and beyond to look for him, why didn't he ever call Daniel in those early moments, in those hours, whenever Daniel had driven off and went missing? And listen, I'm not faulting Ken if he did, make sure to stay away from the tire tracks that were originally Daniel's and marked rocks along the way with red spray paint to mark the path that Daniel had driven on. Good for him. That's the kind of tracking that can sometimes help people be found in these situations. That feels helpful to me. But, he didn't call in those early moments. And, I'm thinking about what would happen if I was in an office working with someone and all of a sudden my coworker, we're working on a project together, she just up and walked out and disappeared without saying anything. And, for maybe the first couple minutes, I'm thinking, oh, she went to the bathroom or she's on a phone call or something. But eventually I'm going to call and be like, hey, the heck, where did you go? You're not leaving me to work on this by yourself. Where are you? What's going on? So it could just be because he didn't know Daniel this well. Maybe he didn't know if he had a history of being kind of flaky. And so he, called Steve to let him know and then was just going to wait it out. But I think personally I would have been a little mad that my coworker just drove off without saying anything. So I personally would have called them, especially if I had their phone number. But that is just something that David really wants to know of, why Ken wouldn't have called Daniel so early if he thought this was so odd. I also find it really interesting that neither of Ken's statements in the police report mention that he made this, path with red spray paint, that he was marking rocks along the way, because to me it feels like that would be really important information to share with the police so that they were able to find Daniel later. He would explain the path he followed in the phone calls, but there's no mention of this red spray paint trail on rocks that he supposedly left, according to David. So Roger, who was at the office that day, overheard a comment about Daniel leaving the work site. So he wasn't super worried at first because sometimes these job sites are so remote that it can take up to an hour even for someone to just go to the bathroom, because they have to go out of these desert locations and find a bathroom or grab lunch or do whatever and then turn around and come back. But after lunch, when he heard again that Daniel had never come back to the work site and no one had been able to get a hold of him, he immediately became worried. He asked if anybody had called Daniel, and when they had and told him that they hadn't been able to get a hold of anybody, he offered to go by Daniel's apartment and see if he was possibly there. At the apartment, Roger found that Daniel wasn't there, his door was locked, and his car wasn't in the parking lot. At this point, Roger reached out to his boss and told him that he would go run by Davisha's apartment and see if Daniel was there. Roger also knew Davisha. In fact, he had given both Daniel and Davisha some extra furniture he had to get them started, and they had even had Thanksgiving at his house the year before. So when he didn't find Daniel at his own apartment, he knew that he should just run over to Davisha's apartment in Phoenix and see if she was there. When he got there, Roger explained what happened, that Daniel had gone out to a job site and left at about 9:15, and nobody had seen or heard from him since, and asked if Daniel was there with her. When they realized that Daniel also wasn't with Davisha and that meant he was truly missing, Roger reached out to his boss and told him that they needed to immediately contact Daniel's emergency contact because he was gone. And of course, Davisha is immediately worried that her brother's missing. She called her father again and explained that Daniel was gone and nobody had seen him since that morning. And at first, David wasn't super concerned. So at first, David was trying not to be too concerned and not panic. So he told Davisha that she should go by Daniel's apartment and see if he was there herself. David, who was in South Carolina at the time, would be calling Daniel and friends that he knew of to see if any of them had heard from Daniel or knew where he might be. So when Davisha got to Daniel's apartment, she realized the same thing Roger did. Daniel wasn't there, his door was locked, and his car wasn't there either. So she called David back to tell him this, and at this point, David hadn't been able to get a hold of Daniel, and nobody else he contacted had heard from Daniel either. David said while he called Daniel's phone, it just rang and rang and rang. So at this point, they went over everything they knew again, and it was at this time that David really actually realized that nobody had seen Daniel since 9:15 in the morning, and he'd been missing for over 6 hours at this point. David decided that he needed to report Daniel missing so they could get searching for him immediately. So he called Tempe police to report Daniel missing because Daniel was a Tempe resident. But because Daniel was last seen in Buckeye, Arizona, the Tempe police transferred him over to the Buckeye police so that he could report him missing there, since that would be where the investigation would have to start. Now, when David was connected to Buckeye PD, they told him he would have to wait until Daniel had been missing for 12 hours. They just pretty much wouldn't take a missing persons report until Daniel had been missing for that full 12 hours at that point. And with the rise in interest of true crime, I think it's something that a lot of people know now, that there isn't really a rule of how long you have to wait to report someone missing. If you need to report someone missing because they're gone under suspicious circumstances, you should be able to report them missing. There's no 12-hour wait, there's no 24-hour wait, there's no 48-hour wait. You should be able to report your loved one or coworker or friend missing if you feel they have gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Now, I can't promise the police are going to go look for them immediately, but you do have the right to immediately tell them that someone is missing. So for me, this is the first red flag. This is either someone who is just refusing to take the report and making up a policy that probably isn't in place, or it's a crappy policy that is in place where they tell people, like, look, we're not going to even search for them until after they're gone for 12 hours anyway, so you should just call back then. But like, if someone tells you this when you call to report someone missing, throw a fit. Lose your mind. Become a Karen. Because you are allowed to report someone missing no matter how long they have been missing. If you feel it's suspicious circumstances, you are allowed to report them missing. And if someone tells you you can't, it's utter bullshit. Because Buckeye PD wouldn't take the report right then, David would call back later. David said in his interview with Kendall and Josh that he actually liked Officer Cruz, which is the first officer he spoke with on the night of the 23rd when Daniel went missing. He felt like he seemed to care, so he was pretty happy with Officer Cruz that first night. Cruz took the missing persons report, gathered what information he could from David, and then set off to start investigating. He told David he would keep him updated on what he found as he started calling people, and then asked that David contact him with any new information or if he heard from Daniel. So I have to admit, even after my rant a couple minutes ago, that I'm a little confused on this timeline. So David states that he was told he had to wait 12 hours to report Daniel missing when he called Buckeye PD. And so that means that he wouldn't have been able to report him until about 9 p.m. that night. But according to the police report released by Buckeye PD, they say that they took the report around 7 p.m. So I don't know if maybe David called a little bit earlier, around like 5 or 6 their time, because it was after lunch that Roger became really concerned. So it was probably like 5-ish by the time they were calling the police the first time. So there's no exact timeline in terms of like when all these phone calls took place, but I have to say that based on some of the other police work that is outlined in the police report, I definitely believe David's story, that they told him he needed to call back in 12 hours, and maybe he just called back earlier anyway because he was worried and managed to get through to somebody. But I wanted to point out that discrepancy in the statements, just so everything is transparent. So after he was done talking to David, Cruz began his investigation with the first logical step. He called Daniel. Just like with David, it rang and rang and rang, but Daniel didn't answer his phone. So after this, Officer Cruz began reaching out to people who David had told him to contact. Officer Cruz started by calling Kevin, Daniel's supervisor at work. Kevin was able to give the officer the exact location of the job site where Daniel had gone missing from, as well as give him Ken's contact information. So after this, Officer Cruz contacted Ken, and that's when he took the first statement that I talked about earlier. So after Officer Cruz talked to Ken, he called David back and updated him with what he'd found so far. According to the police report, Cruz also told David at this time that they were going to go search that desert area to see if they could find Daniel or any sign of him. Additionally, on the Buckeye website, where they have a timeline of Daniel's investigation, they explain that they conducted a ground search in the area near the work site. The police report, though, says that Officer Cruz and Thatcher spent hours looking in this area just for any sign of Daniel or his car. But David said that originally he had told him they wouldn't be able to search this area that night because it was dark already. So I'm not completely sure if there was a search done that night. There's obviously the police record says there were. David says that he was told there wouldn't be one, so another thing to keep in mind. David talks about the fact that there also seemed to be some resistance to add Daniel to the National Crime Information Center, or NCIC. The Department of Justice website says that the National Crime Information Center, or NCIC, is a computerized index of missing persons and criminal information designed for the rapid exchange of information between criminal justice agencies. So basically, if they added Daniel's name and information to NCIC, if he showed up somewhere else or if his car showed up somewhere else, other police stations would be able to have that information that he was a missing person or that he was someone they were looking for. So David said that he had to ask several times before Daniel was entered into this information center, and Cruz's report says that Daniel was added after they searched the desert for him that night, which I'm kind of torn on that. Part of me understands that they waited until after they searched the desert to add him to NCIC, just in case they had been able to find him like hanging out somewhere in the desert. I don't know why he would be, but just like, they were able to find evidence of him. But on the other hand, like if he was in distress somewhere, if he was, running off doing somewhere and he got pulled over, like police in other, counties or cities or whatever would know that he was being looked for. So I think that's what David's main concern was, about him not being immediately entered into NCIC, since they were looking for him at that point. The report also says that at about 1 a.m. on June 24th, 2021, Officer Cruz called Daniel's phone one last time, but again, there was no answer. Now, starting at 6 a.m. on June 24th, Officer Halley would be taking over the case from Officer Cruz as they change shifts. So in the report that's released, there's an initial summary of Officer Halley's, reading over everything that Officer Cruz had written in his previous report. Basically, he's going over Officer Cruz's findings and adding that to the report so that he can, let them know what he knew before he started his own part of the investigation. And the first thing that jumps out at me about this part of the report is that Officer Halley says that in Officer Cruz's statement that he took from David, that David explained that Daniel had been acting strangely, but that David hadn't been able to tell him what strange was. But here's the thing. In none of Officer Cruz's report of that day, at least that's included in the police report that has been given to the public, does it say that David said Daniel was acting strange. Nowhere. He doesn't say in the first supplement of the police report from Officer Cruz, it does not say that David said Daniel was acting strangely. And I feel like if in this report, Officer Cruz's section was even like a summary of what he got from David that night, putting in the summary that Daniel was acting strange would be super important. But it's not in Officer Cruz's part of the report. So this means one of two things, really, that either all of Officer Cruz's notes and findings weren't included in this report that was released to the public, which is understandable, but you would think that even in a summary report mentioning that someone who has gone missing was acting strange would be really important to include, but it's not there. Or this is where the bad police work starts. That's what it means. It's either that they didn't include something that seems important, or that they are, this is some bad police work, and someone is inferring that based on what David was telling Officer Cruz about Daniel, that Daniel was acting strange, not that David specifically stated that. Part of me leans towards the inference theory that, this is allegedly, in my opinion, when the police work goes a little sideways early, because David has maintained to this day that he did not tell Officer Cruz that Daniel had been acting strangely. And at 7:37 a.m., after Officer Halley was done going over everything from Officer Cruz's report, he called Daniel. But this time, Daniel's phone would go straight to voicemail. Another officer, Officer Randolph, would call Daniel's phone again at around 11:45 that morning, and it would go straight to voicemail again. So after Officer Halley had initially called Daniel's phone and it went to voicemail, he called David. So, they talked about the fact that David didn't know where Daniel was and he hadn't heard from him. They talked about who Daniel might know in the area and if David knew anywhere that Daniel might go. And finally, they talked about his physical and mental health. If he had any physical health issues, or if he'd been struggling with any mental health issues or had any diagnoses. Halley's report states that David tells him that Daniel had no physical or mental issues, but that Daniel had been acting a little odd lately. The report states that David says that Daniel had fallen in love with a woman that he'd only met a few weeks before, but that he didn't seem to know a lot about her. After this, Officer Halley asked David if Daniel had ever seemed suicidal before, or if he felt there was any indication that he might want to hurt himself, and David said, no, there's been none of that. They also discussed drug use, and David explained that he really only knew of Daniel smoking marijuana occasionally. They next would discuss Daniel's social media. He had an Instagram and Facebook account. And while on the call, David checked them for Officer Halley, and he didn't notice any new posts on either of them. But he did mention that Davisha had earlier noticed that it looked like some of Daniel's Instagram pictures had been deleted since he'd gone missing. And the Instagram account is something that really sticks out to me. There's not really anywhere else to add it in the timeline, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. So the weird thing is that these pictures being deleted since Daniel had gone missing isn't the only time that something happens to his Instagram account, because there's at some point while they were searching for Daniel, his entire account got deleted and was just completely gone, and then it came back and none of the pictures are there, but now there's his name and a photo, just like an account picture. And so the weird thing about this is that nobody in Daniel's family has access to his Instagram account. They don't have access to it. They haven't figured out the password. So they weren't able to, do anything to it. So it seems odd that, they've had these instances of pictures being deleted and the account disappearing and then the account reappearing. So that's just something that sticks out to me as really odd. I think it has to be some piece of the puzzle, but we just don't know what that piece is and how it fits into all of this. So towards the end of their first conversation, David stressed to Officer Hallie that this was not like anything Daniel had ever done before. This just wasn't something he would do. He never would have run off from work without telling anybody, without telling his work why, and he definitely wouldn't have not contacted his family for this long. He would know how much his family would worry, and he just wouldn't do that to them. So after they hung up on their call, Officer Hallie would then call Davisha. Davisha also hadn't heard from Daniel and didn't know his whereabouts or where he might go. He ran through the basic questions with her. Do you know where he may go? Does he have friends or family in the area besides you? Who should we reach out for in our search for Daniel? And does he have any physical or mental health issues? Hallie brought up that David and Kenneth both said that, Daniel had been acting a little odd, and so he asked if Davisha had been noticing any odd behavior from Daniel lately. All Davisha could think of, and it's on an unspecified date shortly before Daniel went missing, is that at one point Daniel came over to her apartment and came in and just sat down on her couch and didn't say anything. She would try to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond, and he just stared off for like 30 minutes, and then still not talking to her, he just got up and left her apartment. So David discusses this in the Mile Higher interview. He said that whenever he heard this story from Davisha, she didn't mention the 30-minute thing, because he agrees if his son walked into her apartment, sat down, and just stared off for 30 minutes, he would think that was super odd. But he said that whenever he heard Davisha tell the story, she didn't mention that he sat there and stared off for 30 minutes. But hearing David say it, it sounds like him and Davisha were sitting together talking to police, like in person. And according to the report, this statement came from when Officer Hallie contacted Davisha by phone. So it could just be that, the first time she told this story, she mentioned that it was 30 minutes and that was on the phone. But the next time she told this story with her dad around in person, she didn't mention the 30-minute thing. So David does agree, though, that this would be very odd behavior if it happened. He just isn't sure if, this was the actual story Davisha told, because she doesn't say 30 minutes now, that he was just staring off for 30 minutes. So just another one of those discrepancies to keep in mind. So the report also says that Davisha mentioned that Daniel had told her that he was in love with this woman that he'd met, and that she'd sent him a podcast that after listening to it, it had changed his entire outlook on life. It really showed him to stay away from the negativity and bring more positivity into his life, and he felt like it was just life-altering pretty much. Davisha said that it sounded like Daniel and this woman were in a relationship together. When Officer Hallie provided her with the name Caitlin, she agreed that she thought Caitlin was the woman's name and that she lived in Laveen, Arizona. But now, Davisha also says that she never told officers that Daniel said he was in love with this woman. During the conversation David had with Officer Hallie, he was able to provide him with a Facebook page of the girl he believed his son to be talking to, Caitlin, and so basically he found this Facebook page and sent it to him because it sounded like who Daniel had described to him. Hallie asked Davisha if she thought that Daniel might be suicidal based on any of his words or actions, and she said no. And when asked about drug use, Davisha explained that she only knew of her brother smoking weed and drinking alcohol. When Davisha was asked if she had any other concerns for her brother, she expressed that her biggest worry was that he'd never done anything like this before. He'd never disappeared. She shared a story about Daniel deciding to drive off to California and visit San Francisco on a whim. Apparently, he started driving that day, and when he was about an hour away from where his other sister lived in California, he called her up and asked if he could stay there for the night and see her before he headed off to San Francisco the next day. He originally hadn't told anybody where he was going, and like I said, he surprised his sister with this, random visit. And so while he hadn't told anybody about this trip, he did contact his family within the same day and let them know where he was and what he was doing. And even though it was a shock, it was a happy surprise. So Daniel did, in fact, go stay with his sister that night and then go off to visit San Francisco the next day. And Davisha explained that it was around May 30th, 2021, and I looked at these dates, and that was the long weekend of Memorial Day weekend. So it seems like Daniel chose a long weekend to hop in his car and drive over and surprise his sister with a visit, and then just spend the day in a city not that far away from him. He called his family not too long after he headed out, so people knew where he was, and I think that makes it vastly different circumstances than we're talking about now. So after his conversation with Davisha, Hallie would call Kevin again. Kevin explained that he hadn't heard from Daniel, nobody at Matrix had heard from Daniel, and that even though Daniel was on the schedule to work that day, he hadn't showed up at the office or at his job site that he was supposed to be at. He also provided that Daniel had never done anything like this before while he was working for Matrix, and it seemed like really odd behavior for him. So Kevin this time sent Officer Hallie the exact location information of where Daniel had gone missing from, that job site that they were at. And after this conversation, Officer Hallie would then call Ken, and this is when we get that second statement that we mentioned earlier with the 30-minute time difference of when Daniel went missing and when he arrived at the job site. So after this call with Ken, Officer Hallie began looking into who Caitlin was and trying to locate her because she was supposedly the woman that, Daniel was talking to and or in a relationship with. In the police database, he was able to find a Levine resident whose description seemed to match the picture on the Facebook profile David had sent him. So he reached out to Phoenix police and asked them if they could make contact with this woman and confirm if she'd been in contact with Daniel. So the Phoenix police went over to her home and they were able to connect with her. And when they told her what was going on, she agreed that she could be contacted by the police and she would tell them whatever she knew. The Phoenix police also confirmed while they were there that Daniel wasn't at Caitlin's home and she didn't know where he was. So after this, Officer Hallie called Caitlin and they discussed how Caitlin knew Daniel. Caitlin explained that she and Daniel met on June 12, 2021, when she ordered food through Instacart and he was her delivery driver. As a note, this part of the report states that she ordered food, but she actually ordered wine. She and her friend had been drinking on the evening of June 12th, and when Daniel showed up and delivered wine for them, they thought that he was nice, and while she admits that she probably shouldn't have invited him in, she was drunk, and he was on the shorter side. He's 5'8", and he was missing an arm, in her words, so he seemed harmless. So, because he seemed nice and harmless to her, she invited him in to hang out with them that night. We don't know what all took place, but we do know that night they exchanged numbers. She sent him that podcast that he was supposedly talking about that changed his whole outlook on life. She's also the woman that told him he had an ego, which was part of why she sent him that podcast to work on the ego. And Daniel would stay at her house that night with her and her friend. And though we don't know why, at some point Daniel took this canopy he had for work out of his car and brought it into her backyard. It was like one of those tents that you use to just block the sun. And it was something he would use whenever he was out in the desert working at different job sites. So he took that out of his car and brought it in her backyard at some point, and we don't know why. And because he took this out of his car and put it in her backyard, he then forgot about it when he left the next day. So on Monday, June 14th, at about 7:19 p.m., Daniel would text Caitlin and say, "Hey, I accidentally left my canopy outside your house. Is it still there? If so, is it okay if I pick it up?" And then he sent a second text that said, "Also, the podcast was great." And Caitlin replied the next day, on Tuesday, June 15th at 1:37 p.m. saying,
"Yes, you can pick it up whenever."
And Daniel would text her back that day at 8:30 p.m. saying, "Thanks. How do I get there again? I can come now or tomorrow afternoon to grab it." And Caitlin never responded to this message of him, trying to figure out when he could come pick it up. So the next day, on June 16th, he would come by her house. She saw him on her security system camera go up to the door, knock on the door, and then leave when nobody answered. When she saw this, she texted him at 2:06 p.m. saying, "Hey, I saw you on the camera. I'm in Flagstaff and will come home later tonight. If you want, I can put it out front by the chairs before I head out for work tomorrow morning." So at this point in the conversation between Officer Hallie and Caitlin, she would tell him that Daniel then began to become very creepy, sending her text messages of a heart emoji and sending her a text message saying that he loves her. Now, this is a little out of order from the text messages that we have, so I'm going to keep going through the text messages and the dates and times so we can see them in order. So after offering to leave the canopy out at 3:12 p.m., Daniel would text a red heart emoji to Caitlin and a follow-up with a text message at around 10 p.m. saying, "I'm sorry." So Caitlin never responded to this message, and she never put the canopy out on the front porch where she said she would leave it for Daniel the next day. So the next day, on June 17th, Daniel came by her house again looking for his canopy that she said she would leave out by the chairs on her front porch that day before she left for work. Now, Caitlin wasn't home, so when no one answered the door, Daniel went into the backyard and grabbed the canopy for himself and then took it and put it in his car and left. So Caitlin had seen him on her security footage this day, and around 6:39 p.m., she texted him, "Please stop showing up unannounced." And there's no timestamps for the next few text messages, so it seems like it was pretty rapid that they were coming in. So Daniel says, "Okay, I won't ever again." Caitlin responds and says, "Thanks, and I'm looking right now and don't see the canopy in the garage." Daniel answers, "Don't worry about it, I already have it." And Caitlin texts back and says, "I'm confused." Daniel quickly says, "I did grab it yesterday. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry for disappearing the other day. Sad face emoji." And this follows up with a second text message from Daniel that says, "I couldn't stop thinking about you." And Caitlin wouldn't respond after this text message. So on Saturday, June 19th at 12:44 p.m., Daniel would text, "Can we hang out?" And on Saturday at 1:48 p.m., so about an hour later, Caitlin would text, "I'm not home." And Daniel would say, "Okay." On Sunday, June 20th at 12:14 a.m., Daniel would text Caitlin, "I love you." And he would follow that up at 8:28 a.m. with a text that says, "Are you home today?" And at 9:36 a.m., Caitlin would respond and say, "Honestly, you showing up at my house unannounced made me extremely uncomfortable. I will not be home today, but I don't see us hanging out anytime soon." Daniel would respond and say, "Okay, but do you have any doubt? Either way, I'll have to be okay with your answer." Caitlin expressed that she had no idea why Daniel would be saying he was in love with her. She said that she's never done anything that would make Daniel think that he should be in love with her, or that she returned those feelings for him, or that she even wanted a relationship with him. And on Monday, June 21st at 11:44 a.m., Daniel texted, "How are you feeling?" And at 3:46 p.m., he texted, "I'm outside your place." Caitlin would respond with a text message that had 6 question marks at the beginning, followed by, "Please stop doing that. I'm not even home. This is not okay." And Daniel responded, "I guess it's not." Caitlin would then write, "No, you guess," quotations, "I've told you it's not okay and to not come by my home unannounced." Daniel then asked, "Are you okay with me?" Caitlin says, "No," and follows this with a text message that says, "This isn't normal nor acceptable." And Daniel then asks, "What is normal?" And Caitlin says, "Making plans before showing up at someone's home, and if someone has expressed that you've made them uncomfortable, you need to back off." Daniel then asked her, "Do you hate me?" And Caitlin said, "I don't hate you, but please leave me alone." And that night at 8:46 p.m., Daniel would respond and say, "You're right." This is the point where Caitlin says that she became worried because Daniel showed up to her house for a third time unannounced, even after she expressly told him not to do that. Which I have to say, as a young woman and as a woman who has lived alone for a while, this would worry me. Definitely don't want men showing up to my house unannounced. But on the other hand, the first 2 times he showed up unannounced, I can understand why he did. The first time, she said he could come over whenever to get the canopy, and she didn't respond whenever he offered time, so he just went by to grab it, because she told him he could show up at any time. And then the second time, she had told him that she would leave the canopy outside by the chairs on her front porch that night, or that next morning before she went to work. So he came by that afternoon and tried to grab the canopy, and she hadn't left it there. So he just went into her backyard and grabbed it. I don't personally think that that's breaking any boundaries. I probably would be a person who would text and be like, "Hey, I really need this. Can we double check? Or can you give me a time that I can come get it?" But I also don't think he completely overstepped his bounds, because she did say the first time he could come over whenever, and then the second time she would just leave it outside so he could come pick it up whenever he had the chance. I mean, especially because this guy works out in the Arizona heat. I'm sure he needed that canopy. We're going on Wednesday or Thursday before he finally grabbed it. And so I'm sure, just popping in her backyard, grabbing it, and leaving, not a big deal. At least in my opinion. I get the discomfort because I don't like people in my space, but I also think that he wasn't totally out of line with the first 2 visits. Now, the third time he came over, she had expressly told him not to come over unannounced anymore, and I agree that at this point, his text messages had begun sounding weird. That if the text messages are exactly everything in the conversation between them, these are weird text messages, and the fact that he came over to her house, even if the text messages weren't weird, the fact that he came over to her house a third time unannounced after she specifically told him not to, I have to agree is creepy. It's not good behavior. Don't do that. And the final text between Daniel and Caitlin would happen on the evening before Daniel went missing. On Tuesday, June 22nd at 3:07 p.m., Daniel texted Caitlin, "The world can get better, but I'll have to take all the time I can, or we can, whatever to name it. I'll either see you again or never see you again." And like I said, in his text messages to me sound a little weird in these last few texts, and this last one is definitely super weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And Officer Hallie would end his conversation with Caitlin by telling her basically how to file a restraining order against Daniel if she needed to. He explained that while he was putting this in a permanent record, everything she had said, that, this would be on file of his behavior, he also recommended that she report it to her local police, and then told her how to get to the information to file an injunction against him if she wanted to. And I find myself a little torn about this. On the one hand, I'm glad that, the police are offering up this information freely of how to, file an injunction or a restraining order against someone who's making you uncomfortable. On the other hand, this young man is missing and, possibly in danger or distress, and you're now telling someone how to file an injunction against him. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Like I said, I'm kind of glad that the police are readily offering up this information, especially because I do think some of Daniel's later behavior is a little creepy as a 25-year-old woman. But on the other hand, I don't like that he seemed to be insinuating that he agreed that Daniel was a threat. In these moments where, he seems to be in distress and he's missing and he's not showing up to work. But, that's just my opinion. Like I said, I'm torn on it. I don't really think it's a bad thing. But I think that this is the early point where we see that they're going to start painting him as like a kind of creepy guy who was doing weird stuff before he went missing. So I just wanted to point that out, and I don't think, like I said, that it was bad. Because I really think the worst part about this whole thing that bothers me is, thanks to this part of the police report and Officer Halley offering up this information, is that several media outlets and news articles have labeled Daniel basically as a stalker. That he was, stalking this young woman and decided that he was in love with her with no reason, and rather made him out to be this really, really terrible person. While I agree that his behavior was creepy, like he didn't have this long history of stalking or trying to get into her house or doing any of these weird things, it just seemed like something was happening in those days. According to David and the police report, the text messages we have between Caitlin and Daniel all came from Caitlin herself. So basically, because this isn't a criminal investigation, they can't get a warrant to seize anything or search for anything. So Officer Halley asked Caitlin to submit, copies of these text messages to him through a link that he could send her to upload evidence. So she agreed. She took screenshots of their conversations and then uploaded them and sent them to the officer. So here's the thing with that. While it's great that she screenshotted the information, uploaded it, and sent it to him, they are coming from her and not necessarily from her phone, from data, anything like that. So it does kind of lend itself to questions, especially considering David, who has now been able to access his son's phone data through a shared account between Daniel and Davisha, because she's the primary on the account. So she was able to log in, and while they can't see the exact text messages between Daniel and Caitlin, David says that there are many more text messages between Caitlin and Daniel. They haven't been able to access what those text messages say because that's not available on your information, even as an account holder. But he claims that there is much more there to their conversation, and so he feels like if he was saying I love you or things like that there probably is more reason why it came up. And I think the problem is that we don't have, the police didn't collect these text messages, so there is room for argument that they are not everything that happened between them. They are not everything, showing the full picture, because it was not her phone was not taken by police and then all the data downloaded and them showing the text messages. It's just what Caitlin could have given them. And here's the thing. I'm on the fence about the whole Caitlin thing that's going on about him, stalking her or being creepy, because I really don't think his conversations really turn weird or creepy until June 20th. They start to get a little bit more odd after that. And I honestly don't think him showing up to her house unannounced was totally uncalled for until that third visit. Before then, I think that was just miscommunication and the fact that he really needed his canopy. That was it. But I do agree that, him showing up to her house unannounced after she specifically told him not to, and that she wasn't available to hang out, and him texting her, I love you, seemingly unprovoked, it's weird. It's weird behavior. It's creepy. I don't like it. I wouldn't like it as a woman. So, I can't really say much there, but David maintains that there is information that we're missing. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But I also don't really think that Caitlin has anything to do with this. I think this shows us how his behavior was changing somewhat in the days before he went missing, more so than like Caitlin had anything to do with it. I think that's what we need to look at it for. It's a show of his behavior, not of a suspect. That's what we need to keep in mind, in my opinion. So after his conversation with Caitlin, Officer Halley reached out to Tempe PD and asked them to go by Daniel's apartment and check and see if he was there. These officers went to Daniel's apartment and didn't make contact with anybody. They said they could see through a window and see about 80% of his apartment and thought that it looked pretty normal. There weren't any signs of like disturbances and it didn't seem like anybody was home. So at that point, they just left and reported back to Officer Halley. So I kind of have a problem with them not entering the apartment to see the last 20% of the space and just to ensure nothing weird was going on. So from what I found in my research, it's actually legal for police to enter homes on wellness checks if basically they believe someone could be in imminent danger or distress, if they're looking for a missing person, or if there's something very obviously wrong, like with the home. They don't need a warrant to enter at that point. And the reason I'm so annoyed they didn't go in is because, so you can see 80% of the apartment. Nothing seems super, weird or odd, but think about it. If you go in, there's probably a few things they could have learned if, something had actually been happening in the apartment. They could have gone in and seen that there was absolutely nothing wrong, checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the closets, 100% of the space, and said, it doesn't look like anything's missing, doesn't look like there's anything that happened here, so we know he isn't here and he hasn't been home. B, they could have gone in and say Daniel had decided to commit suicide or hurt himself. Maybe they could have found him in the bedroom, either having hurt himself already or where he could possibly still be saved if, it had been like an overdose type situation. But they didn't. And so they wouldn't have been able to render aid and help him. And what if, Officer Halley multiple times has mentioned odd behavior from him. What if there was something going on health-wise that was making him act weird and he ran home and, fell and busted his head on something and was keeled over behind a cabinet or on the floor somewhere that they couldn't see from that 80% of the house from the window, that he could have been hurt and they could have helped him. Or what if something bad had happened and there weren't express signs of a fight, but he was shoved in a closet somewhere, hurt or dead. They would not have known that because they didn't go in, and they are allowed to enter homes looking for a missing person. I appreciate that they didn't want to disturb his privacy or enter his home without, being allowed to, but at the same time, they can, and I definitely think that they should have gone in just to ensure that he wasn't there hurt and needing help or already there and, passed away. But, they could have been wasting so much time looking for him and not known it because they didn't go into that apartment that day. And to me, that's just bad police work. So later that day, Davisha called Officer Halley back and told him that she had reached out to one of Daniel's friends who didn't know where he was. And that friend mentioned that one of Daniel's old roommates had recently visited Daniel in Arizona and stayed with him for a little while, so maybe he should contact him. The name of this friend was Luke, and she was able to give him his contact information. So Officer Halley called Luke, who hadn't known that Daniel was missing, and he didn't know where he was or where he would have gone. He hadn't heard from Daniel either. So Luke had stayed with Daniel the weekend just before he went missing and left on June 20th. The last time Luke had heard from Daniel was on June 22nd, when that evening he had sent Daniel something on Instagram and Daniel liked his message. So Officer Halley shared with Luke that other people had expressed that Daniel had been acting a bit odd lately, so he asked Luke if he knew of any odd behavior or anything weird that Daniel had said while they were staying together. But Luke really hadn't noticed anything odd with Daniel, and so Officer Halley asked if he felt that Daniel may be feeling suicidal or like he may want to hurt himself, and Luke said that he didn't think Daniel was suicidal, but that Daniel had expressed that, he was really glad Luke had come for a visit when he did because Daniel had been feeling a bit depressed lately. But Daniel really didn't give him much information about why he may be depressed, and he didn't bring it up again after this, offhanded mention of it. And really, that was all the information Luke could give to Officer Halley. So after talking to all these people, Officer Halley turned his attention to trying to locate Daniel either through his phone or through the Uconnect system in his car. So David had told Halley that Daniel had the Uconnect system in his car. So Officer Halley reached out to Uconnect to see if they could possibly track Daniel's vehicle and give him the location of where it was. The support employee explained to Officer Halley that Daniel's location would be accessible, but that Daniel had never actually registered his car to the Uconnect system to be able to get that information. So Halley asked if he would be able to, track the car if he made a Uconnect account and then registered Daniel's car to it. And the employee explained that, yes, he would be able to find the location of the car so long as, the Uconnect system hadn't been tampered with and as long as the battery was still connected to the car. So pretty much as long as the car had power, even if it was turned off or it had been crashed, it would, send that location back to him. So with the approval of his supervisor, Officer Halley would make a Uconnect account and register it to Daniel's vehicle. At this point, an email was sent to his work email, stating the last location of Daniel's vehicle. This email would show that at 2:31 p.m., the GPS location of Daniel's Jeep was 0.0/0.0, and the course information was 0 degrees at 0 kilometers per hour. So, though the report doesn't state this, that would then mean that the battery had either been disconnected or the Uconnect system had somehow been tampered with. So they also tried to locate Daniel through his cell phone. The dispatch reached out to Daniel's phone provider, and they put basically a continuous ping on his phone. So they decided to also try to locate Daniel through his phone. Buckeye PD Dispatch reached out to his cell phone provider and asked if they could try to locate the phone. And even though several attempts were made, they were unable to get a signal back on Daniel's phone and where he might be. They weren't even able to get a last location of where his phone had last pinged to give them a place to start. So apparently during this shift, Officer Halley also headed out to the job site and looked in some areas around there, but was unable to locate Daniel or his vehicle. So he talks about searching an area a few miles south of the job site, so Daniel had headed south and then west. So technically it's in the right direction, but he doesn't really give explanation of why it was this area south of the job site or what may have led him there. But he doesn't find anything while he's there. So at the end of his shift on June 24th, Officer Halley called David, Davisha, and Kevin to update them about what was going on in the search for Daniel. He also told them that though they had requested a plane to do an aerial search in the area around the desert to look for Daniel, this request had been denied, but that he would follow up on it the next day and see what he could do to get a plane search out there. And it was at this point that David decided he needed to go to Arizona and be there to help. He said he threw everything he possibly could in his car and just set off driving from South Carolina to Arizona because he felt the police weren't doing enough to look for his son already. I mean, I have to agree a little bit, they didn't go into his apartment just to double check if he was there or not. And additionally, I can understand not wanting to do a plane or helicopter search in a populated area because that's just not going to help. looking for a specific car or person in a city is going to be really hard. But Daniel had disappeared into the desert and had already been there possibly a whole day. And so, he's already out there stranded possibly, and they're not going to send a helicopter just to fly over and look for him when he would probably be one of the only people in the desert. Like, come on, that's just ridiculous. I mean, obviously, they would need to do this helicopter search sooner rather than later, because if Daniel is missing in the desert, wandering around, they need to find him sooner rather than later. So the report continues on June 25th, 2021. Officer Halley reported that he informed his supervisor that Daniel was still missing at this point, and they decided that at this point they would forward it on to Buckeye PD detectives to start looking into this missing persons case. On June 25th, Daniel's aunt reached out to Buckeye PD and asked to speak to a supervisor. She really wanted to express her concerns for Daniel, who was possibly stranded in the desert, and the fact that they wouldn't do a helicopter search for him. And this worked, her talking to the supervisor. They again requested an aerial search, and this time it was approved. But I think the sad part is that it was approved because the family pushed for it, not because police officers who knew in this area how dangerous it would be to be stranded in the desert didn't push for it. Like, I think that's the thing that gets me about this case time and time again. The family pushed for all of this. The police didn't just do it on their own, and that's a problem. And David said that this aunt called and let him know right as he was driving over the Arizona state line that she had been able to get a hold of someone, and that this helicopter search was in fact, going to happen, and they were going to search for Daniel in the desert. So David was very happy to hear this, but he was also glad that he was already in Arizona on his way to be able to do more on site. So the Phoenix Firebird helicopter flew over the job site and some of the area surrounding it, searching for Daniel or his car. On the ground, there was an officer and a sergeant looking around this area for any sign of him on a lower level, but neither the helicopter nor the ground search found anything. So while the search was happening in the desert, Officer Halley also called back to UConnect to ask about this null 00 information that he got on the location. He asked the employees if they would be able to try to get a hold of the location of Daniel's vehicle, and though they attempted several times, they weren't able to get either a current location or a last location of the car. The UConnect employee basically told Officer Halley that this meant one of three things. Either the system had been tampered with, the battery was disconnected or dead, or the UConnect system hadn't properly been updated, so it wasn't able to provide feedback to them. They said if the vehicle was just off, they still would have been able to track it. So that meant that there was something else going on with the vehicle. And this is just something I want to point out. It's a really weird theme throughout this entire police report, that some things are redacted and some things aren't, which you would expect, but some names that have already been named before are redacted, or some names are redacted and then later they show up anyway, so you kind of know who they are. And the most of what's redacted is, people's birth dates and last names and things like that. But there's also some where people's full names and birth dates are not redacted. So it just, other than one or two places, and then obviously redacting last names and date of births, which would make sense. So I feel bad that there are some people in the report who didn't have their, last name and birth date redacted. It just feels like they did it very arbitrarily to kind of be oh, we're withholding some information when they really didn't. And so this area of the UConnect system is one of these times where it happened, because the first time Officer Halley, reached out to UConnect, they didn't redact the UConnect system's name. But this second time when he contacted UConnect, they did redact the company's name. So you still know who they are because they've already talked about it. but it doesn't make sense why they would need to redact it, nor does it really make sense why they would need to redact the company's name anyway. So I don't necessarily know that it means anything. It just was like something that I thought was really odd, and I wanted to point it out because of some of the other weird things that Buckeye PD has done, in my opinion. And on June 26, 2021, at 11:11 a.m., Officer Halley would submit his conclusion for his part of the report. And at this point in the investigation, Daniel's missing persons investigation would be transferred over to Detective Biffen of Buckeye PD. And I feel like this is the best place to stop this first video with this transition from Officer Halley to Detective Biffen. So next time we're going to go into what the detectives do and finding Daniel's car and all these other things. And don't worry, it's not going to take me 3 weeks to get the next video out to you. I am literally going to record it tomorrow, and I would have recorded it today, but it's already 8 p.m. and I am losing all light. But so you can be updated as soon as the second part of Daniel's case comes out, please hit that subscribe button so you can hear the rest of what happened and where they are now in the investigation and what we can even do to help David in his search for Daniel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps my channel out. And again, thank you so much already for 26 subscribers. I am a little blown away that that's happened already. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Bye!